Olivia Kane thought she was confronting her brother's killer. Tommy Grant knew he was returning to clear the name of the man everyone hated. And Daniel Reeves, the town's beloved coach, was already dead, leaving behind a locked room full of secrets that would tear Maplewood apart. Coach Daniel Reeves had always been the kind of man people in Maplewood pointed to with pride. For 20 years, he shaped the town's basketball team into a powerhouse, collecting trophies, banners, and the unwavering loyalty of his players. He had an unshakable discipline that seemed to spill over into every part of his life. His yard was trimmed to perfection, his car spotless, his schedule as precise as clockwork. Parents trusted him with their children, the school relied on his leadership, and the community saw him as a figure who could do no wrong. Yet on the morning of September 14th, that image shattered. The news first broke in whispers. Practice canceled without notice, a police presence on Birch Lane, officers moving in and out of the Reeves residence. By the time evening news anchors confirmed his death, the town was already buzzing with speculation. The official report described it as a violent incident, but no more details were offered. The lack of information only fueled the gossip. Some thought it was a burglary gone wrong. Others muttered about jealous rivals, while a few claimed it had to be someone close to him. The truth was that nobody knew, and the police weren't saying. Officers worked quickly to secure the home, placing yellow tape across the driveway and posting a patrol car outside. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as detectives removed boxes, each one sealed, labeled, and placed carefully into unmarked vans. To the casual eye, the items might have been ordinary, but there was something in the way the investigators handled them, measured, deliberate, that suggested they were far from routine evidence. In the still air of that early autumn day, a strange unease settled over the street. The first real crack in the perfect image of Coach Reeves came when officers stumbled upon a locked door at the back of his house. It was tucked behind a hallway closet, almost hidden. No one, friends, family, or colleagues, could recall ever seeing it before. When the lock was forced open, what lay inside was unexpected. The room was small, lined with metal filing cabinets, shelves stacked with binders, and a desk covered in neat piles of papers. There were no sports trophies, no team photographs, no memorabilia. Instead, the walls were bare, the air stale, and everything inside felt clinical, like an archive. Inside the filing cabinets, police found folders labeled with names and dates. Some contained copies of court documents. Others had photographs, candid shots taken outside of games, in parking lots, even in what appeared to be residential neighborhoods. Each photograph had notes scribbled on the back: times, locations, brief observations. The dates spanned nearly 2 decades. One drawer held nothing but maps with certain addresses marked in red pen. On the desk, a single folder lay open, revealing a team photo from 15 years earlier. 3 faces had been circled in red ink. Each was a teenage boy in a Maplewood jersey, smiling alongside his teammates. Their names were written neatly in the margin. Detectives noted the coincidence almost immediately. None of the 3 had been seen in town for years. One had supposedly moved away without warning. Another had been rumored to leave school after trouble at home, and the last had disappeared during summer break with no official report ever filed. The discovery shifted the investigation from a violent death into something far more complicated. This was no ordinary coach's office. These were not the casual keepsakes of a man who loved his team. They were records, detailed, deliberate, and unsettling. The question that began to take shape in the minds of the detectives was not just who had killed Daniel Reeves, but what exactly had he been doing all these years that required such careful documentation that by nightfall, word of the locked room had leaked beyond the police. In Maplewood, where everyone thought they knew each other's business, the revelation spread like wildfire. The perfect, disciplined, honorable coach now stood at the center of a mystery no one could have imagined. His death no longer seemed like a random tragedy. It felt like the end of a story no one had realized was being written, a story that, judging by the look on the investigators' faces as they carried those boxes away, was only just beginning to be uncovered. The investigation into Daniel Reeves' death moved quietly at first, but it didn't take long for detectives to realize they were dealing with more than just a case of sudden violence. The autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma as the cause of death, the kind of injury that suggested Daniel had been struck with something heavy and unyielding. There were defensive wounds on his arms, signs that he had fought back, but the position of his body indicated the attack had come swiftly, perhaps catching him off guard in his own home. Nothing in the initial search suggested forced entry. Whoever had killed him had either been invited inside or had the means to enter without breaking in. The locked room at the back of the house became the centerpiece of the investigation. Detectives began sifting through the contents methodically, cataloging each piece of paper, photograph, and map. The names in the files didn't appear to be random. Many matched past students from the basketball team, while others belonged to people in town with no obvious connection to Daniel. The patterns were subtle but undeniable. Certain names appeared alongside specific dates and locations, often with short, cryptic notes such as missing from practice or last seen at diner, 9:15 p.m. The photograph of the team from 15 years ago drew particular attention. The three circled faces all had corresponding folders in the filing cabinets. Inside were snapshots of their lives, images outside of school, near their homes, and even at places far from Maplewood. Two of the boys had minimal background information in the files, but the third, Mark Kane, had an entire binder dedicated to him. It contained articles about the team's championship win, personal statistics from games, and a series of handwritten pages filled with observations. The tone of the notes was oddly clinical, documenting what Mark wore, where he went, and who he was seen with. Investigators reached out to try to track down the three former players. One, a boy named Aaron Blake, had reportedly left town with his family, but the forwarding address listed in school records led nowhere. The second, Chris Mallory, had supposedly dropped out of school in his junior year and moved to another state. Again, no official records showed where he had gone. As for Mark Kane, there were no traces at all after the summer he vanished. No phone records, no employment history, no driver's license renewals, nothing. It was as if he had ceased to exist. The theory began forming that Daniel's death was connected to one of these disappearances. If someone believed he was responsible for what had happened to these boys, they might have confronted him. Or perhaps, someone connected to the missing players had returned to seek revenge. The problem was that the files didn't contain any direct evidence of wrongdoing, just fragments of information, enough to raise suspicion but not to prove anything. As detectives expanded their search, they discovered that Daniel had been making anonymous cash payments over the years to various families in and around Maplewood. These payments were often made quietly through money orders, leaving no paper trail that linked them directly to him, except for the occasional receipt found in his locked room. Curiously, several of the families who had received money were connected to players from his teams, including relatives of the three boys in the circled photograph. Investigators began to wonder if these payments were hush money, an attempt to buy silence about something that had happened in the past. Another possibility was that Daniel had been paying for private investigations into the disappearances, working behind the scenes to find the missing boys. Without more context, the purpose of the money remained unclear. The atmosphere around the case grew more tense. Reporters camped outside the police station, waiting for updates. Neighbors began recalling odd moments from years before: late-night lights in Daniel's office, unannounced trips out of town, a habit of being secretive about his personal life. None of it had seemed suspicious at the time, but now it all fed into the growing image of a man with hidden motives. The police followed every lead, but each seemed to end abruptly. No one in Daniel's immediate circle admitted to knowing about the locked room, and none of his current players or assistant coaches could explain why he would keep such extensive files on former students. The deeper they went, the more they were convinced that the motive for his murder lay in something buried in those cabinets. And yet, for all the paper and photographs, there was one thing missing: any sign that Daniel had spoken to someone about the information he was gathering. There were no emails, no letters, no phone records to suggest he had shared his findings with law enforcement or anyone else. It was as if he had been collecting it for himself, waiting for a moment that never came. That silence was what troubled investigators the most. If Daniel had been sitting on a dangerous secret, then whoever killed him might have struck not just to end his life, but to erase the chance of that secret ever coming to light. The most disturbing discoveries came from the basement of Daniel Reeves' house. During a second, more thorough search, A detective noticed an area of the wall that didn't sound solid when tapped. Closer inspection revealed a false panel, cleverly fitted and painted to blend in with the rest of the room. Behind it was a narrow storage space, no more than a few feet deep, stacked with unmarked boxes and a small metal shelf. The dust inside suggested it had been untouched for some time, yet everything was neatly arranged, almost like a private archive. Inside the boxes were dozens of old camcorder tapes, each labeled in Daniel's neat handwriting with a year and a name. The labels ranged back nearly 20 years, covering almost his entire career as a coach. Most tapes appeared to be game footage or team practices, but some stood out immediately. They had no obvious connection to sports. A few began with scenes in the gym, but drifted into late-night recordings of empty hallways, deserted parking lots, and closed-off areas of the school. Others featured one-on-one training sessions in the gym long after the rest of the team had gone home. While most of these private sessions seemed harmless, several were unsettling. The camera lingered for long periods without explanation, capturing players looking uncomfortable or glancing toward the door as if they were waiting for someone to arrive. In certain cases, the players on these tapes matched the names from the files in the locked room upstairs. Among them was Mark Kane, the boy with the largest folder in Daniel's cabinet, and Tommy Grant, another player thought to have disappeared. One technician handling the tapes made an alarming discovery. The fingerprints found on several cassettes matched Tommy Grant's, despite the fact that he had been missing for over a decade. The match was confirmed twice in the lab, ruling out error. That single finding sent a ripple through the investigation. It meant Tommy had been in Daniel's home at some point, possibly after his disappearance, or that the timeline everyone believed was wrong. Detectives began to consider new possibilities. If Tommy had been alive well after people thought he'd vanished, then maybe the story of his disappearance was false or deliberately misleading. The question became, was Daniel hiding him, protecting him, or keeping him against his will? Tapes were carefully reviewed, and patterns began to emerge. Some were recorded within days of one another, almost as though Daniel was conducting surveillance on certain players during specific times of their lives. In a few, the same locations appeared again and again: a wooded trail just outside of town, an abandoned storage lot, a rundown diner off the highway. These places were plotted on a map, revealing a small triangle of territory Daniel seemed to revisit over the years. Adding to the mystery, several tapes were missing their final minutes of footage. They ended abruptly, as if someone had deliberately recorded over them or cut them short. The splices were too clean to be accidental. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were erasing. Detectives returned to the thought that Daniel's death might have been to prevent the exposure of whatever was hidden in those missing moments. If the truth about the disappearances was on one of those tapes, destroying it would remove the only proof. It was possible Daniel had been reviewing the tapes himself, piecing together his own investigation, when someone decided he was getting too close to an answer. The fact that Tommy's fingerprints were present raised another disturbing idea. He might still be alive and living under a new identity, perhaps even nearby. If so, he could be the key to explaining why Daniel kept such careful records. But finding someone who had been missing for so long without any trace would not be easy. Every lead seemed to draw the investigation deeper into a maze of contradictions. Some evidence painted Daniel as a dangerous man with an unhealthy interest in his players. Other pieces suggested he might have been tracking them to keep them safe from something or someone else. The problem was that the evidence didn't align neatly into either story. By the end of the third week, the case had shifted from a local tragedy into something much darker, with threads leading far beyond Maplewood. Detectives knew they were no longer just looking for a killer. They were unraveling a network of events stretching back years, one that might reveal not only why Daniel Reeves had been murdered, but also what had really happened to the boys, whose names had been locked away in his secret room. And somewhere out there, the truth was still in the hands of someone who had managed to avoid being found for over a decade. The turning point in the investigation came when the DNA evidence from under Daniel Reeves' fingernails returned from the lab. The profile matched a woman named Olivia Kane, a nurse living several states away. Her name had not come up in any prior stages of the case, but a deeper look revealed a direct link. She was the older sister of Mark Kane, one of the three boys whose faces had been circled in the old team photograph. Mark had been a star player 15 years ago, vanishing the summer after leading the team to a championship. His disappearance had never been treated as a criminal matter at the time, chalked up to a troubled teenager leaving home. The connection between Olivia and Daniel's files was undeniable. Detectives learned that Olivia had checked into a small motel on the edge of Maplewood just 2 days before Daniel was killed. Hotel security footage showed her entering late at night, carrying a single duffel bag, and leaving briefly the following morning. There was no record of her visiting anyone in town during those days, and she had not contacted local police or her former neighbors. The timing of her arrival was suspicious enough, but the DNA under Daniel's nails suggested there had been a physical struggle between them in the hours before his death. Digging into Olivia's background revealed no prior criminal record and a stable life as a registered nurse. However, investigators also uncovered something more personal. For over a decade, she had been quietly trying to track down her brother. Former classmates and neighbors recalled how Olivia never accepted the explanation that Mark had simply left. She had contacted private investigators, made trips to towns where he might have been seen, and collected every rumor that reached her ears that a search warrant for her apartment uncovered a locked wooden box hidden at the back of her bedroom closet. Inside were newspaper clippings, school yearbooks, and photocopies of court documents. Much like Daniel's files, Olivia had been gathering her own archive of information about Mark and his time on the basketball team. But among her notes was something more revealing: a small, leather-bound journal filled with entries spanning several years. The early entries described her frustration with the lack of police action when Mark disappeared. Later pages became darker, filled with observations about Daniel Reeves, his trips out of town, the way he attended events unrelated to the team, his habit of keeping certain players close while distancing himself from others. The writing grew more agitated over time, suggesting that she had become convinced Daniel had been directly involved in whatever had happened to her brother. One of the final entries in the journal stood out. Dated just 2 days before the murder, it read simply, "I have everything I need. It ends now." The stark tone of those words left little doubt that she had reached a breaking point. Detectives pieced together a likely sequence of events. Olivia had returned to Maplewood with the intention of confronting Daniel. She may have planned to demand answers or force a confession, but something in their encounter had turned violent. The defensive wounds on Daniel's body and the DNA evidence suggested that he had fought back before being fatally struck. The prosecution began building a case that Olivia had acted out of vengeance, believing Daniel was guilty of harming her brother. Yet the defense pointed to the files in Daniel's home, arguing that they indicated deeper secrets that might justify Olivia's suspicions. It was possible, they claimed, that Daniel had tried to harm her during the confrontation, and that she had killed him in self-defense. The problem for investigators was that, even with Olivia as a suspect, the underlying mystery remained unsolved. No one could explain the missing boys, the tapes in the basement, or the carefully kept records spanning decades. Olivia herself refused to speak about what had happened that night, offering no statement beyond a formal denial of murder. Still, her presence in town at the exact time of Daniel's death and the overwhelming physical evidence linking her to the scene made her the most plausible suspect yet. As she was formally charged and the trial preparations began, the case seemed poised to finally reach a resolution. Yet in the minds of those following the story, a larger question loomed. Had Olivia truly silenced a predator, or had she killed a man who might have been the only person still searching for the truth about her brother? The trial of Olivia Kane drew national attention, transforming Maplewood from a quiet town into the center of a media storm. Courtrooms were packed, reporters lined the courthouse steps, and every detail of the case was dissected in news headlines. The prosecution presented Olivia as a grieving sister consumed by suspicion, who had allowed her anger to turn into calculated violence. They argued that she had stalked Daniel Reeves, gathered information on him for years, and returned to Maplewood, not to seek the truth, but to take revenge. The physical evidence, her DNA under Daniel's fingernails, her presence in town at the time of his death, and the journal entry declaring "it ends now," was, in their view, irrefutable. The defense took a different approach. They painted Daniel as a man with a shadowed past, someone whose locked room and hidden basement tapes revealed disturbing patterns that could not be ignored. They leaned heavily on the unexplained disappearances of the three boys from the old team photo, arguing that Olivia had been right to suspect him. The defense claimed Olivia had gone to Daniel's home for answers, only to be attacked when he realized she was close to uncovering something he had hidden for years. In this telling, her actions were not premeditated murder, but an act of survival. Midway through the trial, an unexpected development shook the courtroom. A man in his early 30s came forward to testify, someone believed to have been missing for over a decade. It was Tommy Grant, one of the names circled in the photograph, and the owner of the fingerprints found on the tapes in Daniel's basement. His appearance caused a visible reaction in Olivia, who stared at him as if she were seeing a ghost. That Tommy's testimony was unlike anything either side had anticipated. He claimed that Daniel had not been a predator, but a protector. According to Tommy, years earlier he and other young athletes had been targeted by a gambling ring that sought to manipulate high school games for profit. This ring had pressured players into throwing matches, threatening them and their families when they resisted. Daniel had discovered what was happening and had quietly worked to shield the boys, hiding some of them when threats became dangerous. The files, maps, and tapes were part of his effort to track the criminals and gather evidence. Tommy said that Mark Kane had been one of the boys Daniel tried to protect, but that the threats against him had escalated quickly. One night, Mark vanished, and despite Daniel's efforts, Tommy never saw him again. He suggested that Mark's disappearance had nothing to do with Daniel's wrongdoing, and everything to do with the dangerous people who had been watching the team. The revelation left the courtroom divided. If Tommy was telling the truth, then Olivia's entire motive for confronting Daniel was based on a misunderstanding. But there was no proof beyond Tommy's word, no evidence of the gambling ring, no records linking outside criminals to the missing players. Without physical proof, the prosecution dismissed his claims as an attempt to rewrite history and protect Daniel's reputation. The jury deliberated for days, struggling with the tangled threads of the case. In the end, they found Olivia guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, suggesting they believed her actions were not entirely premeditated. She was sentenced to a term that would keep her in prison for several years, though far less than the life sentence the prosecution had sought. For Maplewood, the verdict brought no real closure. Some residents clung to Tommy's version of events, convinced that Daniel Reeves had died a misunderstood hero who had carried the weight of dangerous secrets alone. Others believed Olivia's suspicions had been justified, that the strange files and unsettling tapes hinted at darker truths still buried in the past. Mark Kane's fate remained a haunting question mark, with no new leads emerging even after renewed searches. The gambling ring Tommy described was never uncovered, leaving the possibility that it had either never existed or had been dismantled long ago, leaving no trace. When Olivia was let out of the courtroom after sentencing, she kept her eyes forward, refusing to meet the stares of reporters or townspeople. Whether she felt remorse, vindication, or something in between, no one could say. In the years that followed, the story of Daniel Reeves' death became something of a legend in Maplewood, a case that blurred the line between villain and victim, justice and tragedy. His locked room and its contents were sealed away in the police archives, inaccessible to the public. Whatever truth lay within those files would remain hidden, and the final chapter of the coach's life would be left to speculation. Even now, some say that the real story died with him, and that somewhere out there, someone still knows exactly what happened to Mark Kane and why Daniel Reeves had guarded that secret until his very last day.